Mr. Shestokas is representing Reverend Lee who was indicted along with President Trump in the Fulton County, Georgia election interference case. I'm also going to give you a Give, Send, Go for Chaplain Lee. It is just givesendgo.com/Chaplain Lee. Let me begin with you, Chaplain Lee. Talk a little bit about your background and your life, because I'm sure that the last thing that you expected as a pastor, as a chaplain, as someone who has a long career in law enforcement, to find yourself in this bizarre situation of being indicted in an election case in Georgia.
Yeah, Dinesh. Thanks for having me and Dave on your podcast here. I do appreciate it, and very well stated in terms of my reaction. This is very shocking. It's very serious. Something I never would have expected. Something, of course, I've never experienced in my life. I've always been on the other side of the issues. In terms of my former life in law enforcement as a local and federal officer, always supporting the Constitution and the rule of law and the laws, and obviously a very clean background. But then transitioned to ministry midlife, and because of my prior experience, I was encouraged and indeed did follow a ministry track that included not just local church ministry, but also law enforcement chaplaincy ministry. And as part of that, have done lots of things, including training, developing curriculum and teaching at one of our seminaries, chaplaincy, producing books, including a Bible for law enforcement. We've got about 40,000 of those out over the years in 5 editions, including also a book that I wrote for officers called Back Up on the Beat. And these things are still available, used on Amazon sometimes. But then also doing direct, what's called critical incident response of major national significance, starting with Columbine, but including Ground Zero, 9/11, and Katrina, lots of hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, even a tsunami, lots of mass shootings, in ministering to people, whatever their needs happen to be, and trying to help, all according and in keeping with the rule of law and being respectful of professional kinds of ethics and things of that nature.
Let me turn for a moment to you, David, and ask you this. I mean, you've got this upstanding citizen. You've got this guy who's a pastor, and he's based in Illinois. How does he get dragged into this Georgia case? I understand that they're trying to make a sort of RICO conspiracy argument here, and I'm guessing that in a conspiracy you sort of need to rope in a bunch of people, because otherwise, if they were to just indict, let's just say Donald Trump, they'd go, well, how can you have a conspiracy of one guy? So you got all these other people who are kind of looped in, some of whom appear not to have had any dealings or contact with Trump directly. So talk a little bit about, as from a legal point of view, I mean, how do they rope in Pastor Lee into this Georgia RICO case?
Well, I can tell you some of what their theories are. I certainly don't disagree. I certainly don't agree with any of them. You mentioned about President Trump. Pastor Lee has never met President Trump. He doesn't know him. As best of my knowledge, he's never even been in the same room with him or Mayor Giuliani or Jenna Ellis or Mark Meadows or any of the other big names that are involved in this. And yet somehow or other, they've accused Pastor Lee of being part of this RICO, racketeer influenced corrupt organization, which apparently the stated goal is to illegally overturn the 2020 presidential election nationwide. I think that's interesting for people to note is that Fannie Willis, the district attorney of Fulton County, seems to have declared that she has jurisdiction over the entire country, not just over what things that happen in Fulton County, because that includes they have 161 what they call overt acts, and among the overt acts, they have lawyers giving legal advice. They have folks giving lobbying state legislatures in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, in addition to Georgia. And of course, Pastor Lee, they say that he knocked on a couple of doors. And when he knocked on these doors, what they say his intent was to influence a witness and intimidate an election worker illegally in an effort to overturn the 2020 election. And while some of this sounds very curious, Dinesh, I think it's important for people to note that we have to take this very, very seriously, because in the overall RICO charge, there's the president, Pastor Lee, and 17 others. And the potential penalty for that is 5 years in minimum Georgia State Prison, up to 20 years. And it's not, it's a mandatory minimum. A judge doesn't, there's no community service, there's no probation, there's no home confinement. It's a mandatory minimum 5 years in a Georgia State Prison. And I think people need to know that even though some of it sounds like, geez, lawyers giving legal advice, all these other things that are actually exercises of the First Amendment are being criminalized. And the people that are cheering these things on don't understand that they're cheering on the demise of their own civil rights when they cheer on this activity. Certainly, we expect to have a jury, and Pastor has already entered a plea of not guilty. And you heard him mention what his experiences are. And you know, he's an American hero. He's not a criminal, but he's been at Columbine. He chaplained in the post 9/11 to the NYPD and the hurricanes. Any place there's been some sort of chaotic situation in the United States of America in the last 30 years, Pastor Lee has been there. And I would suggest that Georgia was in chaos in the aftermath of the election of 2020, and it would not be unusual to find Pastor Lee to be in Georgia.
Let's take a pause, guys. But before and we'll be back in a moment. The website to go to, Give, Send, Go. This is a place that you can donate to his legal defense. GiveSendGo.com/Chaplain Lee, L-E-E. So GiveSendGo.com, Chaplain Lee. I'm back with Reverend Steve Lee and his attorney, David Shestokas. And we're talking about the Georgia RICO case. Reverend Lee, let me turn to you and ask just about the experience of the arrest, the indictment. Kind of walk me through a little bit of how this went down. Did you get a phone call? Did you get a letter? Did someone show up at your door? What exactly happened to sort of draw you into this criminal case?
Yeah, and here, if it's okay, Dinesh, I'll defer to David, and happy to discuss, especially my life before all of this, but I really have to defer to him, and that's in this situation.
Go ahead, David. Talk a little bit about what happened to Pastor Lee, and you've talked about what he's facing.
Yeah, in the initial situation, Dinesh, I think it's worthwhile to have people know that in November 2020, the special purpose grand jury in Georgia, in Fulton County, Georgia, sent a subpoena to Illinois to compel Reverend Lee's testimony in their investigation. And for folks that don't understand this, a state court's authority to compel testimony ends at the borders of the state unless they get cooperation from the state of residence of the witness they're seeking. And so we wound up having 3 hearings before a judge in Illinois, in Kendall County, Illinois. And at the conclusion of that, the judge made a finding. He said, they haven't even presented enough evidence to consider Pastor Lee a material witness in this matter. And he denied the request to compel his appearance. After that, we didn't hear anything from folks in Georgia until waking up on the morning of August the 15th to find out late at night Fannie Willis had held a press conference indicating the indictments were issued. So that was actually the very first after the court activity in Illinois, when the Illinois judge says there's not even enough for him to be a witness. And so then after that, we actually never got any kind of official notification. All we had was the press conference, and what she said in the press conference was that there was an August 25th date to surrender and things of that nature. And so we wound up, I actually wound up tracking down the prosecutors in Georgia. We never actually had any official notice from them for anything. And ultimately, we had this conversation, myself and we have local counsel in Georgia, and they portrayed it in the media as if the counsel for the defendants were having some sort of negotiations about surrender. There were no negotiations. They said, here's the conditions of bond. When you get done with it, it's a $75,000 bond for Pastor Lee. I said, Pastor Lee, he's given his situation, he doesn't even own his home. There's no probability of him coming up with the 10% or $7,500 to do this. They said, well, we don't care. So that was the situation. And so an organization in Illinois by the name of the Illinois Family Institute started a fundraising activity for Pastor Lee. By the evening of Thursday, before the date to surrender, they'd only raised $4,000. And they'd only started 3 or 4 days. But they'd raised $4,000 by that point. I did a podcast that night with Silk of Diamond and Silk. And I explained to her, and she was telling her audience what was going on and asking them to help out. And at the end, she said, well, if this doesn't work out, he's going to be arrested and won't be in church on Sunday. I said, that's right, ma'am. She said, I am going to make up the $3,500 that you guys are short. And she did that within the next couple hours. So he'd gone to bed the night before we were going to fly to Georgia, thinking he was going to be in custody the next day. And he didn't even know until Friday morning when he was on his way to the airport that Silk had done this and that he was going to actually not be taken into custody on that Friday. And so it's pretty astounding. You might ask him about his preparations. He was planning on doing Bible studies in the jail, and he'd given me a long list of what would be necessary for his incarceration. As you know, these are not simple matters to deal with. And so we were astonished and astounded because of what had happened here in Illinois back in November. We were astonished to find him indicted along with this other people.
We are not able, just because of the nature of litigation, to go into the details of what he is alleged to have done or what was his state of mind when he did this, because that's really what the state of Georgia is trying to prove, I guess, that he had nefarious intentions and that he was trying to somehow overturn a legitimate election in Georgia. But let me ask you the broader question, because you have made the statement that there are 5 rights that are specified in the First Amendment. We think of the First Amendment as freedom of speech, but if you look at it more carefully, there's more in it than just that. There are 5 rights in the First Amendment, and all of those are being violated in this case. Talk about what those 5 rights are and how they're being violated.
Absolutely. There's 5 rights, as you mentioned: religion, speech, assembly, press, the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. When you get said and done, you've got an indictment against the president for giving a speech. For starters, you have Pastor Lee indicted for knocking on people's doors, and of course, in a pastoral setting. So you've got some religious issues involved in this matter. The petition the government for redress of grievances. You have Mark Meadows, Jen Ellis, Rudy Giuliani, all indicted for lobbying state legislators. And so it goes on and on, Dinesh. There's 161 what they call overt acts. Each and every one of those, absent 2, 159 of them are actually protected First Amendment activities, and they are declaring these to be illegal in the state of Georgia. And if people do not understand that they should, what they need to understand about this case is we need to defeat this case on every level, because if we do not, their rights under the First Amendment are gone. The First Amendment will have been eviscerated and will have no longer exist. It will exist only on paper. And so I suggest to folks that they really need to take an interest in what's happening in Georgia.
I mean, I agree with that. And the site to donate is givesendgo.com. One word, givesendgo.com/Chaplain Lee. Reverend Lee David Shestokas, thank you very much for joining me.